Good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm delighted to welcome you and everyone who'll be listening in to this inaugural session on the Conversations on Global Development Politics, which we're organizing as part of the PSA's specialist group on global development politics. Um, we've really thought of this series as a way to think about the profound transformations that are shaping our world, where we look at questions of poverty and inequality, capitalism and democracy, climate change, public health, changing forms of human personhood, all whatever however you want to put it, because of the ways in which the political and economic structures that have framed social life for over 2 centuries are being reconfigured. We're thinking of this portal as a way of looking at problems, as a way of spotlighting innovations. And to do that, we want to chat with experts who have written books on the subject. So the aim really is to think about the latest books that have been written on the politics of global development, chat about those books with their authors, get to know them a bit more, and to really sort of come to terms with what's being written about politics and the way in which what's being written about global development politics and the ways in which it's being sort of thought, rethought, etc. So I'm really pleased that joining us today is Professor Claire McLoughlin. Um, I hope I got the pronunciation of the last name right. If not, I apologize, Claire. But Claire is an associate professor at the University of Birmingham and has been part of this massive project on writing about the politics of development, which is the book we'll be chatting with Claire about. The idea is to, hear from you, Claire, about the book itself, and your wider sort of academic trajectory, any tips you might have for us, and for people who are interested in reading, writing, that sort of thing about development politics. This is designed to be very informal, so there are no presentations, no PowerPoints, unless the speakers want, and it's styled to be much more conversational. So colleagues who are joining in, if you have questions, feel free to sort of type them out, put them in the chat box, and we'll see if we can pick some of them up, but no pressure, because we really want to hear about the book itself and how it came into being. So I think that's by way of introduction. That's how I wanted to that's what I wanted to say, and I think we can sort of now take a deep dive into the book. So welcome, Claire, formally. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get into talking about the book, Claire, I'm sure are people who are sort of joining in and will be listening to this hereafter, would be sort of interested to know a bit about your personal journey, how you came into academia, what your own research is about, and how you got interested in it.
Brilliant. And can I start by first of all just saying thank you. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be the first in the series in particular. And thank you for picking such a youthful photograph of me for the advertisement, which I have no incentive to update online whatsoever. Thank you to colleagues who are here as well. There are some of the other editors of the book here. And I was only part of a team of 5 editors, so I hope to bring up to 1/5 of the brainpower today, and I hope that they will step in for me if I don't do justice to any of the book's arguments, but I'll give it my best shot. So yeah, as Indrajit said, I'm an associate professor. I have been in academia for the best part of 20 years, but prior to that, I worked in the public sector, actually, in the UK public sector. And the one thing I learned about the public sector was that I don't want to work in the public sector. So now I learn about that, and I teach governance and public service delivery. And my kind of core interest really is in the provision of public goods and services. And this question, I suppose, of who gets what, when, and how, and the politics of that. And that kind of really brought me, I suppose, into the politics of who gets what, when, and how, which is kind of the core mission of the book, really, is to understand that better.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think that's really, really nice to sort of hear about your career before academia, even if you may not sort of be extremely pleased about it in retrospect. But yes, thanks for sort of leading into the book itself. So yeah, tell us, how did politics of development come into being? What was your motivation, as it were? And of course, this is a collective effort. So, you know, how was the team assembled?
Yeah.
I'm tempted to ask, how did you assemble the team? But presumably that's not quite how you'd like to see it. But yes, tell us a bit about how the book itself came into being.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't me assembling the team. There was no coercion involved. It was definitely collaborative. But I think the story of the book really starts and ends with its core audience, which is the students, right? So we've written this book ultimately to try to inspire and motivate the next generation of thinkers and potentially workers and students and learners of development to think about the politics of this kind of core pursuit, really. So IDD, the department that I work in, we launched some undergraduate programs in 2020 in development studies. And we kind of really wanted to make sure that students have this informed learning around the politics of development. So we introduced this new module. We designed this new module called the Politics of Development. And like all new modules, you kind of have the idea of it, and then you try to put together a really accessible and varied reading list that will really inspire students to think critically. And while we found there was quite a lot written about the politics of development in various different pockets of literature, there wasn't really one book or one place that we could really nudge them towards, and certainly not really something that started from an intuitive place or from a kind of interdisciplinary perspective. So after having done all this work to launch this undergraduate program and write this module, we then thought, well, why don't we just write the book that goes with this module and that will support the program? But then we kind of hit the core intellectual challenge of the book, really. And I suppose I would frame that like this. So obviously these days we can all agree that everything about development is political. You hear people saying this all the time. But if everything about development is political, what is the politics of development then? What is it specifically? When you drill down into these two concepts, development and politics, they're actually really similar. They're actually very difficult to disentangle. So, for example, if we think about what politics does, its function in society, we might typically think about it as, you know, organizing powers, driving and influencing decision making, and being kind of the fuel behind the distribution of resources in society. And then if we think about development and its function, it's kind of equivalent, right? So also we think about development as this process of change, which involves elites and actors vying for power and influence, and people kind of disputing the way things should be and what's right and wrong for society. So almost politics and development are so intimately intertwined that it becomes almost tautological to say there is something called the politics of development. So we had to kind of really think about this. Where does the politics of development kind of start and end then? And we can't write a book about everything. We can't write a book about the politics of everything. And then to bring it back to students, because I said that's where the story kind of starts and ends, we kind of owe it to them really to put some parameters around this topic. We're not saying we need one singular definition of the politics of development, but certainly if we're writing modules about the politics of development, and there are more than 30 undergraduate modules with that or similar titles in UK universities alone. If you're a student signing up to a course on the politics of development, what are you signing up for? And what can you actually expect to learn about? So that's why we kind of decided to have a go at pinning this down, pinning down this concept and trying to make it accessible for students. And then the process kind of evolved from there. And I always like to speak of it as kind of this tally of numbers. So we had 5 editors, we had 21 authors, we had 5 reviewers, we had 2 rounds of review, 2 workshops to plan the book, classroom trials, 2 of those, and actually quite remarkably, we wrote it over the process of about 18 months. It ended up being 362 pages, to give another number, and there were zero arguments, but that's for another conversation maybe.
Yeah, I'm sure people will want to know the source and the way in which the 0 arguments sort of materialize, but yeah,
We're
you're
still
right.
friends mostly.
Yeah. I'm sure, yes. I mean, I see some of them here, so
they're still here.
at least you all are seeing each other, even if it's on Zoom.
Exactly, yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's great because you're right. Everyone does say, I mean, not everyone, but, lots of people do talk about development as being political and, development is politics and arguably politics is development. But I think people do struggle to think about, what is not politics of development, and I think that's thinking about the boundaries as you tried to do, or all of you tried to do, is I think very welcome. And maybe you can sort of talk us through the themes of the book itself, and I think that'll help us to sort of and may even provoke questions about why these themes and why not others. But before that, to say that yes, development is political, but also the need to draw boundaries between what is really politics of development and what would come under politics of development rather than only development or only politics, because of course arguably all politics is about who, when, what, how, those sort of classic questions that you mentioned. But yeah, I think it'll be really nice to hear about the themes of the book, and I'm sure colleagues here would have already taken a look at what's online, but it'll be good to sort of hear from you, what the themes of the book really are. Tell us about themes covered in the book.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right. I agree with you that, people say these days, or it's kind of a truism to say, well, all development is political, but sometimes I feel that's where the conversation ends. And of course, to sort of acknowledge something is not the same as defining it or explaining it. So in the book, we try to pin down the definition of the politics of development, or we offer a politics of development definition, let's say, that can be contested and can be challenged, and we hope will just provoke a conversation. And so we actually define the politics of development as a process of contestation, and specifically as a process of contestation over what we call alternative desired futures. So I will try to break that down a bit because there's a lot of words in there. Right. So, I mean, fundamentally, what we're trying to do is bring the definition of politics within development. We don't think that, you can just think of development as an add-on to politics. If it's part of this within politics of development, then, it kind of makes it more meaningful for students as a real thing, right? As an actual locus of inquiry, as a focus of analysis. So we're really focusing in on the book in this process of contestation. What do we mean by process of contestation? We don't just mean contentious politics in the way that Tilly and Taro might define it, or kind of everyday acts of resistance in the way that James Scott might think of it, but actually as a more neutral and even everyday way of challenging, of negotiating, of mobilizing for and against a certain course of outcomes, how people generate rules, how they contest those rules, how they decide, ultimately compromise on what actions should and shouldn't be taken. So it's a bit of a more neutral and I suppose more a broader definition of contestation. We didn't define development as a kind of end goal. We didn't want to define development as a sort of set of objectives, not as growth or as, I guess, social cohesion or as a certain kind of level of well-being or income. But we really wanted to think about development as something that puts people at the center of that definition, and where they get to decide for themselves what is the pursuit here, what is at stake and what is being contested. And that's why we came up with this term, alternative desired futures. So we kind of trying to jettison this idea that development is good change, or it's always good for everybody. It's never an unqualified thing, as we know, right? There are always winners and losers. And the fact that we've put in alternative into the phrase means that we recognize there's always going to be a diversity of perspectives on what is desirable and what's not. So, and that is actually the very heart of development, is to contest what is desirable or not. So that's what we've that's how we've put the boundaries around what we think of and what the book focuses on, really, as the politics of development. And I think that brings us really to then think about kind of everyday contestation in a variety of state spaces, a much more pluralist interpretation of the politics of development than just thinking about it as voting behaviour or as happening in formal arenas, or as a particular lens on development, as achieving certain predetermined indicators. So that does make it hard in a way to cover the entire universe of what is the politics of development, but it also gives us a focus of analysis.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's exactly that, like looking at the way you mentioned, thinking about what development is in a way that's sufficiently pluralistic, but not so broad that it defies any definition or indeed understanding, because if everything is everything, then what do you sort of do? And I mean, I can see, how people might sort of endorse thinking about development in terms of, alternative desired futures, as you said, but also push back on, and you've already sort of mentioned some of this, what really is an alternative, who is desiring it and who's not. And, some people's futures might be other people's pasts. And, so time doesn't necessarily operate in that linear teleological way. But I think it's a good way to start thinking about, development, even if it is to provoke questions and
Mhm.
to provoke debate, which I'm sure this book will, among your students and among all of us who will read it as well. And some who are sort of working on textbooks themselves, but we'll come to that in a
We'll come
bit.
to the experiences of that. So,
Yeah. But about the themes themselves,
yeah,
if you wanted to sort of take us through the themes
yeah,
of the book, how you thought it fit with the way you're sort of setting out the contestations over alternative
yeah,
development futures. And I'm sure some were more opportunistic themes than others. But yeah, tell us,
yeah, for
take us through
sure.
that,
Yeah.
to the underbelly of your theme development.
I would love to say that we had this coherent thought process and plan from the outset, but as with many things which involve intellectual reflection, it was not that linear process of let's have a plan and let's decide these chapters are going in. But I can talk about that a bit, maybe when we talk about what was included and what was not included in the end. But to come back to the themes of the book then, I've mainly talked so far about this definition of the politics of development as alternative desired futures. Defining something or trying to define something is great, but obviously that's not really enough. And especially for students, we're actually trying to encourage them to analyze, right, and to apply this kind of thinking to political puzzles, to some of the development challenges that we face around the world. So actually, the core substance of the book is about analysing and unpacking the politics of development, sort of moving from conceptualisation to action. And to that end, we do offer, I hesitate to say framework for analysis, but it kind of is a way of thinking, an analytical framework rather than a technical tool. Not a blueprint or a predictive model, but just a way of thinking about what's happening inside this process of contestation then. How can we, as thinkers, students, researchers, activists, better understand this process of contestation in order to really grapple with how it might be changeable, or what's maneuverable about that process to try to improve outcomes, some of the outcomes that people are interested in. It reminds me, actually, after we wrote the book, I read an article by Young Ang, which is in World Politics in 2023, where she makes the case for an adaptive political economy. And she compares toasters, I don't know if you've read this, with toasters with trees. And she talks about how when we're thinking about frameworks for understanding politics, sometimes we have a tendency to think about politics as toasters. There are wires, it's kind of complicated, but ultimately, if you just put all the wires in the right place, the toaster would work. A mechanical engineer could take the toaster apart and put it back together. I'm diverging slightly. I will get back to the point, I promise. But actually, politics and the politics of development is more like a tree. It's a complex system. There are ingredients, but they're much more organic and unpredictable. And I like to think that what we did in the book was something similar to what she's advocating, which is a kind of adaptable political economy of development. And we kind of set out what we think are the core ingredients of contestation. But of course, they're organic and they could evolve in various ways, in the same way that all trees look different. So anyway, those three ingredients in our framework are institutions, interests, and ideas. Now, these are all very familiar to people who work in political science, sociology, political economy, but we try and bring them together into a single, we hope, memorable 3 I's framework. So what we argue really is that everywhere there is contestation, there are institutions or rules being contested by people with competing interests, rational actors with more or less competing interests. And those actors are holding actually a range of ideas about what is right and fair. that are themselves influenced by their cultures, their perceptions, their ideologies, their belief systems. So you have these three ingredients operating within any system of contestation. And that's the kind of foundation that we then apply in the book to a wide range of development issues, contemporary issues, historical contestations, to try to kind of really illuminate what Yang calls the order of complexity. So what's going on in the tree system. And so we apply this framework, this 3I framework, to think about a bunch of questions like, why do people get excluded from certain opportunities? Who makes the rules, and why and how? Who has decision-making power? When do ordinary people actually make and contest rules for resource distribution? What happens when those rules are not accepted and when contestation fails? Why do some processes of contestation result in violence? So we have this kind of core framework of the 3 I's that we try to apply to some of the most fundamental, I think, dynamics of politics that underlie what we might consider some of the biggest challenges for global development, whether it's, climate or health or education or water scarcity or, any. I think that's the beauty of the framework, really, is it's kind of applicable to any challenge at any layer of society that people really want to investigate to get behind.
And give us a flavor of the actual maybe the sub-themes, if you will, within each. What you say, you refer to institutions as the sort of rules, and obviously some would say, well, institutions are about the formal rules, others would say they're informal rules. So if you can give us a sense of the actual topics you covered under these 3 themes, that'll I think also help us get a sense of how you were looking at these 3 themes and what you were including.
Yeah,
or
sure.
excluding in it. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, the book is structured so that we really set out this analytical framework first and foremost, right? So we have a chapter on institutions, a chapter on interests, and then a chapter on ideas. And in those 3 chapters, we kind of set out what those are. And they're all sort of framed a bit provocatively. So we might say, in the institutions chapter, do institutions really rule, right? Which is that Danny Roderick claim, that they're the ultimate kind of mechanism via which we see differential outcomes in development. That ultimately they're kind of first and foremost variable in that kind of development conundrum. And so we really take this on and we challenge this, and we kind of look at the kind of counter arguments to institutions. Do they really rule? Under what circumstances do they rule? And how do formal and informal rules really interact? Customary institutions, how does governance really become much more messy in that institutional space? But then we kind of move into the next chapter, which is about interests, and we kind of say, well, institutions don't just make themselves, right? People make institutions, and people have interests, and especially some interests matter more than others. So we have this question then, development in whose interest? And that's actually written by David and Samin. And yeah, is that right? Yeah, that's right. And so then we would ask, well, who has power to kind of push their own interests above others in society and make decisions that influence people's lives, and why? And we really contest this idea that all interests are bad for development, because I think that's often the assumption, right? That we have elites, they're always predatory, they're always undermining development outcomes, but we need interests to have development. Otherwise, we would have no one actually mobilizing around them. And then finally, we have the kind of really in-depth examination of ideas, so which is often the one that I think is missing from political economy frameworks. We often think about interests, we often think about institutions, but not as much ideas. And actually, whose ideas matter, how our perceptions, worldviews shaped through the development process, who has power over and through ideas, whose ideas have historically been influential and why, and that chapter's written by Nick and myself. So we have this kind of framework, and then we look at some actors in development and how their institutions, ideas and interests have shaped their role. So we look at governments, markets, we look at citizens, and we look at we look at aid as the kind of key, I guess, actors that have interests, institutions and ideas that are part of this contestation. And then in the third part of the book, we look at some actual kind of really zoom in on some contestations around things like, how does petty corruption happen? How do services get provided? What is happening in terms of contestation around climate change? What is happening in contestations around conflict? And all those chapters are kind of framed as, again, quite provocative questions like, why doesn't everyone get the same? How can I jump this queue? Which I can explain a bit more maybe as we go along in the conversation. But essentially, we have this, just to summarize this 3 parts. So we have the kind of, what do we think are the core ingredients of contestation? Who are the actors who are doing the contesting? And what are their kind of interests, institutions and ideas? And then we kind of apply that to what we think are some fundamental questions about the politics of development.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that's really helpful, because it does convey, how your, what factors you think matter most when you think about the politics of development. And it's good to sort of obviously have a sense of the topics that are included under each of these, themes. And there's always a question, and I think you alluded to this in the beginning as well. There's always this question of, well, you could be tempted to write about everything, but you can't. And there's a question of what you include, but also the question of what you exclude. And sometimes the exclusions are, well, opportunistic, we didn't have the expertise on this, or we didn't have the time, or we didn't know enough, etc. Sometimes there are more programmatic reasons for excluding certain topics than others.
For sure.
And I think it's fairly clear to us, how you're sort of looking at, the topics to include. But if you can tell us about the topics you chose to exclude, maybe not the ones that you chose to exclude for pragmatic reasons, because that's obvious enough. There's a reason you may not exclude.
Yeah.
You may not include something because, well, you didn't have anyone to write on it within your network. But were there discussions, or as you said, there were no arguments, but were there no arguments over what you chose to exclude eventually? And I will come back, because I think it's a good, your point about framing each topic as a question is really interesting. I want to come back to that. But before that, I just wanted to get a sense if there were any topics that you decided was great, interesting, but maybe not fitting within this rubric.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna start describing the book not as a process of contestation in and of itself, actually, which is probably quite a relevant label, the politics of book writing. So I will probably just answer that question by giving you a couple of concrete examples. One thing we decided to include, and one chapter that I think illustrates our overall approach. So first of all, one chapter that I haven't mentioned yet, which is in the book, one that we felt very strongly we needed. In fact, I think we felt we couldn't really write a book about the politics of development without it, is a chapter called Whose Knowledge Counts. And this comes after the introduction. And it really challenges the reader, we hope, to think critically and kind of think about their own positionality in terms of what they know, what they think they know, their starting assumptions, and how the world of knowledge has been fundamentally shaped by past and present contestations, right? So how the world of knowledge has been shaped by the history of colonialism and the systems of knowledge production that are unfair and unjust, which have led to the place ultimately where we can sit down in our privileged positions in a Western country and write about this, drawing on as much as we possibly can and making a concerted effort to draw on a variety and diversity of knowledge, but also recognizing that the representation of knowledge, of lived experience, is limited by histories of colonialism. So we have this really critical and I think really stimulating book opening by Zenobia Ismail, which talks about what is the nature of evidence on the politics of development? How is that in and of itself political? And I think that's really important to us because ultimately what we're trying to do in the book is get students to contest fundamentally knowledge, to test their own knowledge. So that kind of represents hopefully where how I think we were quite thoughtful in the book about our own positionality as authors and about the systems of power that reproduce knowledge. In terms of one example of what we didn't cover, so if I think about what I work on, which is the politics of service delivery, we might have had chapters on education or the politics of health or the politics of water. We didn't do that because instead of having kind of more sectoral approach, if you think about it, we could have had chapters, if we went sectorally on the politics of climate change, we could have had chapters on the politics on particular systems within or institutions. We could have had chapters on voting, or we could have had chapters on particular contexts. We could have had chapters on the politics of development in sub-Saharan Africa, which of course would have been ridiculous, but has been done. I mean, these are some of the other ways that people cut up the text, right, is to try and think about particular sectors or particular mechanisms of politics or particular regions of where politics might look different. But instead, when I was thinking about how can we cover this idea of people's access to basic services, health, education, water, let's think about this from a point of view of contestation. How do people contest in the everyday for these services that they need to thrive and survive? And a lot of that is about sort of actually bending and breaking the rules, right? And when we think about how people navigate through their lives, how they avoid getting stopped and fined, or how by a traffic cop, or how they might try and use their politician and their clientelist links to try to negotiate or navigate access to the rights and entitlements that they have, but which are mediated by these political actors. Then what we're really thinking about there is what we and you would call as well, because you write about this in your own work, the kind of games within the rules. So we wrote a chapter instead of focusing on education, health and water, on games within the rules, and it's called How Can I Jump This Queue? And we look at how petty corruption and patron-client relationships really shape the development of access to services, and how that evolves through and around and has effects on state-society relations. So, and I think that's an illustration of how we try to think about politics as not a mechanism, not happening in a specific place, but as the more fundamental everyday questions that affect people everywhere who are just trying to survive and thrive.
Thanks. I think that's really such an important way to think about what to bring in and what to leave out, from the point of view of coherence, as well as sort of sticking to the framing of the work. And sometimes I think people can be dogmatic about it, but I think it also helps to have a sense of what would work best within this framing, recognizing that there is no right or wrong way. As you said, there are various ways in which things can be cut up, text can be cut up. I mean, we might prefer some, others might prefer others, but I think it makes sense to think about the exclusions. And I think it's really interesting to think about taking what might be a view that some people would find would not make sense to some people because, they would say, hey, what about education? Or what about, X sector or Y sector? Especially people who sort of think about development as a set of practices rather than processes. And I think it's really, really interesting also from the point of view of thinking about the book itself and how you position it and how you brand it. If I'm interested in the politics of education, I look at this book from the point of view of thinking about how politics works generally and how the politics of development might work generally, and what are the key things to look out for, but maybe not get into the specifics, for which I might read somebody else's work on education, which would be much more informed than folks who are trying to do something else. So I think that's helpful to know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was certainly the aim.
But that also sort of got me to think about the way the chapters are structured. I mean, one of the things I really liked about the book, and I think whoever reads it will really appreciate it, although some might quibble with that kind of framing. But I mean, I kind of found it interesting is, each chapter is framed as a question. And of course, a question by its very nature, there are certain things that can be included and certain things that can be excluded. But tell us about the framing as a question. Why did you decide this strategy? What was sort of going on, and how do you think it helps the reader? Framing each chapter as a question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think it has been really well received, actually. I mean, we use the same approach on our module, the politics of development, where we kind of label each week as a question. And some students get really nervous and they think, well, what's it about? What are we going to cover? What ideas and what concepts do I have to learn about? So some people find it unnerving, but then others find it really stimulating. And I think that was the point of the book, really, was we didn't want to write a book that just imparts information. No one does. I mean, unless, I don't know, maybe some disciplines, but not in social sciences. We're trying to enter into a critical conversation with the reader, right? And we use questions to kind of signal that each chapter is not going to present them with a singular way of thinking about a topic, but rather kind of offer them a dialectic. So for example, in Nick's chapter, which looks at kind of the nature of the style of government, whether we're talking about more or less authoritarian, more or less kind of internally coherent, disciplined, we could have just called that types of government, but that would have been really boring. So we ask the question, are some governments better than others? Kyling's chapter, where we kind of, she's looking at the role of identity-based exclusions and why identity is so poignantly and important in determining who gets what and when. We could have just said identity construction or, interdisciplinarity intersectional identity theory, but we called it why does my identity matter? Because we're trying to get people to think about, put themselves in a sense in the situation of the people that they think they're studying, because we're all that person as well. Development applies to all of us. So I think a couple of things it does for the reader is it tries to bring them into the reality that they're studying, because they can have their own experience of that. And it tries to stimulate them to use their own judgment rather than just to kind of read about a particular one way of thinking about that. And we don't just use questions as headings, but we use them within the chapters as well. So we have these reflective questions throughout the question throughout the chapters. So I'll give you one quick example, which is in the chapter that I was just mentioning about how can I jump this queue? The use of kind of informal ways of navigating through the rules to get access to goods and services. We have a kind of provocative question, which is, why is there a difference between an official rule and how it gets implemented in practice? So depending on where you live, you might have an entirely different view on that. You might even not agree that it is the case if you live in a particularly top-down or authoritarian even context, or one where the bureaucracy is fairly autonomous from the centre. You may think it's a good or a bad thing, depending on your experience. You may think that some bending of the rules is important, and that might even be socially or culturally acceptable where you live. It may be that it's a survival strategy. It's normatively acceptable, and it leads into conversations like, well, when is a gift a bribe, or what is a bribe, and when is a bribe acceptable? So these are the kinds of dialogues that we're trying to encourage in the classroom, and we're trying to encourage people to start from their own lived experience and to have empathy. Actually, we're trying to encourage empathy from one lived experience to another, and to share those differences, and actually maybe even, now I'm thinking about it, stimulate contestation around some of those core questions within the classroom. And in our experience, it works really well.
Thank you. I mean, it is always sort of interesting to think about, putting having chapter titles, of course, and, the content in a way that, relates to people. I see a lot of text these days, using the second person very often, so to address the reader directly. And I think, some of your chapters are, often in the first person as well. How does my identity matter, for example?
Yeah.
It's fascinating strategies. And just to remind ourselves, this is a textbook that is aimed at primarily your undergrad students. So these are folks who've just finished their high school and are entering this big bad world of the university. So it's probably even more interesting way to, make them feel comfortable, but also make them,
Uncomfortable.
challenge, exactly,
Yeah,
challenge their
disruptive by
comforts.
design. Yeah, I think so. I think we're trying to provoke them.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it probably works, because it really is, no, my identity doesn't matter, or somebody else's identity
Yeah,
matters, or,
yeah,
I'm above all this, or
yeah,
not into this, and I think it's a good way to sort of get people to think about exactly how and why their, I suppose, assumptions about themselves might be questioned.
right. Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think that sort of gets me also to think about, of course, how the assumptions of the readers, other readers, might also be challenged. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the sorts of questions or issues you think this book raises, partly because, of course, no book can do everything, or probably should even aim to do everything.
Yeah.
But also there are obvious sort of areas that you might have thought to cover, but, not in this one, or, that we need to know more perhaps, or, somebody else could do that sort of thing. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the sorts of questions or issues this book raises, which of course also leads to any suggestions you might have for, the sorts of future research agendas for your colleagues like us, but also obviously your students, people who are going to read it. And not all your students will probably be interested in academic careers per se, but the question of, areas of future research, stems beyond academia. It's not only academics who do that sort of research. So if you had any thoughts on these sorts of questions or issues you think the book raises. And at this stage, I just want to also mention we are about 10 minutes to 1. And the way the conversations are framed, as I might have mentioned for everyone else who's joining in, we don't necessarily envisage a Q&A at the end, but obviously if you have questions that you want Claire to address, please do put them in the chat box. and we'll see, we can sort of go through those. But as I said, no pressure to put questions, and this is not sort of a very typical academic seminar where we are necessarily having to ask that smart question. We can just listen if we want to listen. So yes, Claire, tell us what sort of further future areas of research that
Yeah,
you think
yeah,
the book evokes.
yeah. Well, it's funny, you were saying, oh, this is kind of a good framework for undergraduates, but actually I teach a master's course in governance for development, and I've used the 3I framework in that class to encourage my students to pick a kind of development, a complex development problem, a wicked problem, and use the framework to try to unpick it and to and I trialed this last year, and I had an incredible array of assignments from people looking at the 3 I's and how they're kind of behind the issue of unfinished development projects in Ghana, corruption in urban transport in Philippines, water scarcity in Morocco, and ultra processed foods in Fiji. So I think the first thing I want to say is, yes, there is a kind of simplification in the book to try to help this framework be usable, but I actually think there's a real intellectual contribution behind this framework. So one of the things myself and colleagues will be doing, I think, over the next sort of 12-18 months is trying to develop this conceptually, this kind of build out from this idea of institutions, interests, and ideas, and how they shape politics into a kind of a more systemic way of thinking about the politics of development. Because I think we wrote the book, and then we kind of were quite pleased with the way that it's been received, and so we want to develop it intellectually and a bit more. So that's good, and it's definitely applicable for students. I would definitely encourage academics to think about using it in assignments, because it seems to really stimulate students. One thing, I think there are lots of unanswered questions. There are always more unanswered questions than there are answered ones. And I think one thing is, how does the bigger context kind of affect the institution's interests and ideas that we're looking at when we're looking at the process. So processes are obviously shaped by bigger structures, bigger societal wide structures. And I'm thinking particularly about, I'm working on a project right now that's looking at protracted crises, and the number of protracted crises in the world. The definition of protracted crises is almost morphing into all fragile countries, because most fragile countries in the world now are regressing or slipping back into crisis. Conflict recurrence is increasing, fragility and violence is increasing. So I think one thing we only started to do at the end of the book was look at how different conflict dynamics, different state dynamics, the nature of the state, and maybe the nature of the political settlement as well, can trickle down into these processes of contestation. And I think somehow there's a way of better weaving all of those connections together, and maybe developing a more situated account of contestation that can really adapt to crisis and conflict, which I think is one of the biggest challenges we face as a society. So I think more contextualization, more practicing of the 3 I's framework, more testing of where it can be useful as analysis, and more for us, I think, a bit more conceptual development.
Thank you. We've got a message thanking you for this. They have to leave early, but I mean, I think that's in the nature of these things.
Yeah.
No, I think it's really sort of good to think about the broader structural questions. I mean, after all, a lot of the early writings on development were political economy of structural sort of sorts, and then people realize, I suppose, that they were getting the structures right, but not really getting what was going on. And I think now there's probably now that we know what's going on, it's probably also good not to lose sight of those structures that are changing. So I think, especially in the context of crises and what constitutes a crisis and what you might sort of, how you might think about the politics of development in a situation of
Yeah.
protracted, prolonged, overlapping, whatever you want to call it, crisis, is good to sort of know. And on that note, I wondered if more generally you had any tips, given your vast experience of having a relatively non-argumentative process of writing a
Yeah,
text. No,
yeah.
I'm not going to shut up about the non-argumentative, but no, I mean, if you had any tips for others who are sort of interested or, thinking about writing a textbook on development. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be necessarily on development politics, but on the issue of on the area of development. If you had
Yeah,
any tips,
absolutely.
please.
And I probably should say, some of it can be spoken about in this forum. Maybe some of it's unspeakable. If people are thinking about writing a textbook, by all means contact me if you want a coffee or a virtual coffee. I really tried to think about what I could say that wasn't just, know your audience, understand try to make it coherent, think about diversity, all of that, inclusion, because those things are obvious. You can get those from a publishing website. But I think if thinking of more fundamentally, I think what really inspired me, and I think my co-editors in this book, was that we made it intellectually challenging for ourselves as well. I can't think of anything worse than just writing a book that conveys things you already know in a very linear way. And books are not really there to convey knowledge. Even textbooks, I don't think they're there to convey knowledge and information. I mean, yes, we've got theories in the book. Yes, there are text boxes. Yes, there are over 300 references. But I think the main thing is, if you're not enjoying writing it, if you're not stimulating yourself in writing this intellectual project, then it's not going to be fun for the reader either. So my big tip would just try to be provocative, try to provoke yourself and push your own limits of knowledge and challenge yourself to think critically, and then you will do automatically that for the reader. And then I think the other thing is just road test the book. So we definitely wrote it for students and a little bit with students as well, which did make it better, And I know these days students often want everything distilled and maybe in a 25-second TikTok, which is apparently the optimum absorptive capacity. And I'm not advocating that, but I think, advocating for a kind of middle ground that doesn't dumb things down, but maybe keeps chapters to a kind of hour-long read, which we did actually test in the first focus group. We asked students to read the book and tell us how long it took for them to read a chapter, and things like this. They kind of matter. I mean, if you want students to read a book and be interested in it, then you kind of have to make it absorbable to them and inspiring to them, and writing style and length is really important, I think. So yeah, I suppose you could say in a way, again, we come back to the audience, the students, and what we're really doing this for as educators is to impart our own enthusiasm for this topic onto them. And I think part of that is adapting to where they're at, where their starting point is.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of food for thought there as well for so many of us who are sort of either in the process of writing a textbook or have finished and are sort of thinking about what we could have done better, or indeed are in the process of writing second edition. So I think knowing your audience, especially an audience which is with more and more limited attention spans, is interesting. And it's not, I think, just a generational thing. It's a political economic thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And finally, to sort of come back to where we started, tell us, Claire, about your own future plans. I mean, the textbook is a big thing to immerse yourself in. And I can imagine, I'm not suggesting that everything else was at a stop, because I don't think our lives work quite like that, even if
Mhm,
we'd have liked them
mhm,
to. But
mhm.
I'm sure there are things you want to come back to, and there are future research agendas sort of
Mhm.
waiting or brewing, which you now have time to come back to. So yeah, if you can sort of tell the group, quickly about, what areas you're sort of thinking of.
Yeah,
I'm also saying this because, of course, we'll stop in a bit and people are already leaving, but we will upload this on
yeah,
the YouTube
sure.
channel. So
Yeah.
people listening to this might be interested in learning more about your work, about your
Mhm.
future work, getting tips about your future work, or indeed, reaching
Mhm.
out with proposals for collaboration. So if you had any thoughts
Sure.
on, if you wanted to share what your future work
Yeah.
was around.
Yeah, thank you. I think the first thing I would say is oftentimes writing a textbook is a bit daunting and seems a bit tedious. And of course, in terms of REF, which we're all in this system of REF, or those of us in the UK, not always the most acknowledged, and I would say that that's all true, but actually it's been my great privilege to work with the co-editors, and it's been one of the best things I've ever done in my career. And it's brought me into conversations like this one that I would not have been in. And so from just a simple, expanding your collaborative and your relationships with other academics and finding people who have shared interests, doing a textbook has absolutely not been a diversion from my research. It's actually elevated me, and I feel much more, yeah, immersed in conversations now. So I would absolutely recommend it. Yes, I will be going back to my own research, I will be looking at spaces of contestation in protracted crisis, actually. I'm doing some research with the World Bank, looking at how we can use the Three Eyes framework to try to understand contestations around education, water, sanitation, and access to healthcare in very difficult humanitarian contexts. And what the framework that we'll be using is thinking about them as these spaces of contestation. So again, just another way of saying I do think it's a good general way of thinking about organizing thoughts around really complex development challenges. And it will bring me back to my original research, which is on service delivery, but allow me to use some of the things we've done in the book to inform it. And I think every academic journey is cumulative, right? In that way, every project you do, you pick up something that you then apply to the next one and the next one and the next one, and that's the beauty. That's the beauty, and I guess the privilege of what we do as well. So, yeah, I'm just very thankful to have worked on the book.
Great. No, it's amazing you can still say that. I think, I mean, I
Yeah,
see some of your co-authors are still here, but others have left. So I'm sure you could have taken this whichever way you
yeah.
like. But, no, thank you so much. This is incredibly useful to hear. I mean, I think we're always sort of reading about people's work, and I'm very, very grateful that you shared with us, Claire, the sort of inner workings of the textbook writing, but also your career trajectory and how things fit into one another or not. I mean, of course, one of the amazing things about academic careers being cumulative is you also know what to drop, and
Yeah,
that that understanding, I think, helps,
absolutely.
even if the actual themes don't stay with
Right.
you.
Yes.
Well, folks, that's we're over the hour already, but I think that's testimony, Claire, to what an interesting piece of work this is and how incredibly useful it is, and the sorts of questions that it provokes for all of us. Thank you so much, Claire, for joining
Thank
us.
you.
Thank you, everyone who stayed with us till the very end. A reminder, this was the conversations on global development politics. This was our first session, the launch, as it were, and we're incredibly pleased that we could do this with Claire McLoughlin.
Thank
But
you.
thank you, Claire. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Claire
much. It's been a
McLoughlin from the
pleasure.
University of Birmingham. We'll be continuing these talks, and we'll have the next one on the 26th of September on state capitalism with Ilyas Almi and Adam Dixon. So hope to see some of you there.